In this example, we'll learn how to keep data in memory to avoid losing it after calling another object, and then return to the first one. To illustrate the situation, the previous example will continue to be used. Here's a short summary. In the web panel that we see on screen, when entering values in the filters, the grid is refreshed and shows only the data that we're interested in, conditioned by those values. Selecting the Update action in one of the rows, as we've seen, will take us to the attraction transaction in Update mode. There, we can edit the values corresponding to the selected attraction. We can choose one of the attractions to modify, for example, the Louvre Museum. We change the image corresponding to the attraction photo attribute and select Confirm. Note that this action brings us back to the web panel. The reason is that the work with pattern applied to the attraction transaction has automatically added the return command in order to return to the caller object. This can be seen in the Events section of the attraction transaction, programmed within the AfterTRN event. The AfterTRN event is triggered when the transaction has completed a cycle, immediately after the commit operation, that is, after a header has been recorded with the corresponding lines. The return command's function is to end the current execution on this object and return to the caller object. In this example, both the WW Attractions from Scratch web panel and the attraction transaction, in other words, both the calling and the called object, are objects with a graphical interface. So in this case, the return command is the equivalent of invoking the web panel for the first time. It would be different if one of these two objects didn't have a graphical interface, as is the case with a procedure. There, the return command of the object that was called will take us back to the next line right after the invocation. In this case, when returning, the events associated with the web panel loading will be executed. First the start event, followed by the refresh and then the load events. The latter is executed as many times as there are records in the grid that meet the conditions stated in the conditions property. Since here, the conditions don't apply if the variables are empty, at runtime, we'll see that all the attractions are reloaded. Why does this happen? It'll be explained very soon. First, let's look at the behavior of the web panel created automatically from the pattern section of the attraction transaction. We filter by attraction name by entering the letter L. All the attractions that begin with this letter will be displayed. In this case, the only one that has been entered with this characteristic is the Louvre Museum. Now, we select the action to update this attraction. Note that it'll take us directly to the attraction transaction and show us the selected attraction, allowing us to edit it, exactly as in the case of the manually implemented web panel. After changing the photo and confirming the update, we'll return to the calling web panel. Note that the filters are kept. This is exactly the feature we need to achieve. Next, a solution will be programmed in the web panel, and an explanation will be provided about the way the pattern does it. Remember that the variables stated in each object can only be used within them as long as the objects are active. For example, in this case, the moment we invoke the attraction transaction from the web panel, the WW Attraction from Scratch object is destroyed, and we get its variables. Therefore, any values that were saved will be lost. On the other hand, the attraction object will take an active status. Then, when returning from the transaction to the web panel with the return command, the latter object and its variables will be recreated. This is why the filter values are no longer displayed. It's actually a new object. Also, the variables used as filters have been created again. The ones existing before invoking the attraction object were destroyed. This answers the question asked a moment ago about the reason why the values entered in the filters were not kept after a record was updated. we need to save the information of each one of the filters in a sort of global variable, so that it's not lost between executions. That is to say, when passing from one object to another. In this case, between the web panel and the transaction, and from the transaction back to the web panel. So how do we keep the value of a variable in memory? Using Genexus, we can program this feature using variables of web session type. These variables allow us to handle a group of global variables, in which we can store data and access it from any object while the session is active. This is exactly the purpose of the example. A major advantage of these variables is that they allow us to store a set of data of the key value type. So we only need to create a web session variable and use it to save all the filters we have, each of them with a unique key. In this way, there's a key and a value for the country ID filter, another key and a value for attraction name from, and finally for attraction name to, the three filters that we need to keep between runs of the panel. This meets the need to temporarily save the information entered in the filters, to retrieve it later. Let's see how to program this. First of all, we create a variable and call it web session. When we give it this name, Genexus assigns the web session data type, understanding that this is probably what we're interested in, which in this case is correct. If it's not the case, we can always change the data type automatically assigned for the one we want. Then, we'll have to consider when we want this variable to keep the desired values. Remember the main events that are currently scheduled. The start event, which will be executed only once when the page is first loaded. The refresh event, which will be triggered after the start event and every time a filter within the grid conditions is changed or the page is refreshed from the browser. And the load event, which will be executed after the refresh event as many times as data is loaded in the grid. This event will be executed n times because it has a base table associated with it. From these options, clearly the most convenient one would be within the refresh event, since every time we change any of the filters, this event will necessarily be triggered. And that's when they would be saved in the session variable so that we can retrieve them when returning from the transaction. But there's also another event, which is the click event of the update variable. The event will be triggered immediately after clicking on the update action. This would also be useful for saving filter values here. It's a good option, since this is the event where we'll invoke the attraction transaction, and as we've seen, this is the exact moment when the calling object is destroyed, and we get its variables. That's why we need to save the values of the filter variables before doing this. If we do it in the refresh event, we'll save the filter values every time we change data in any of them. Since it's in the grid conditions, every change triggers this event. But this isn't necessary, as we may not need to update the filtered attractions at all in the current run. And in that case, why would we save those filters in the session if the variables are not going to be destroyed? However, if we do it in the event related to the update action, we'll save these values only once, when it's essential to do it, immediately before the object and its variables are destroyed. This will be done in the click event of the variable. We type the web session variable and apply the set method to store values in it, as the first parameter we need to enter a key, which must be a value of character type, so we must enter it in quotes. In this case, it's called country ID. This unique key will later be useful to recover the value we save. Then we must assign a value to it, which will be the data we want to store in memory. In this case, we'll want to save the value of the country ID variable, which will be the value of the first filter we have on screen. Keep in mind that the entered value must also be of character type. So, as the country ID variable is of numeric type, it must be converted to the character type. This is achieved by applying the toString method to the variable. We do the same for the other two filters, attraction name from and attraction name to. Next, the application will be run again, and values will be entered in the filters. Remember that every time the value of one of the filters is changed, the refresh event is triggered, followed by the load event for every record loaded in the grid. Then we select the update action of an attraction. At that moment, the event update.click will be triggered, which has been programmed to save the filter values in the web session variable. This is done in order to invoke the attraction transaction later on. As we've seen, it'll be the moment when the web panel object and its variables are destroyed. After changing data in this attraction and confirming it, the return command will be applied. Since in this case it's the equivalent of calling the web panel object for the first time, the start, refresh, and load events will be run again for each value to be loaded in the grid. Now, we'll need to be able to retrieve these values saved in the web session variable. What do we think would be the best time to retrieve these values? We go over the events we have and assess them. In the start event, in the refresh event, in the load event, or in the update.click event. Clearly, the only one that will work for us here will be the start event. As we've seen, this event is executed only once when the web panel is loaded for the first time. And when returning from the transaction, it's the equivalent of calling the web panel for the first time, and it's precisely the moment when we need to retrieve those values. In order to assign a key and value to the web session variable, we use the set method. Now we need to know how to retrieve the value stored there. We do this using the get method, in which we must indicate the key of the value to be retrieved. Then, to each variable used as a filter, we apply the get method, sending the key corresponding to each one by parameter. This will be done first for the country ID variable step by step. We enter the country ID variable and assign it the value of the get method of the web session variable, passing the key as a parameter, i.e. country ID. Remember what has been said before. Web session variables only store data of character type. As the country ID variable is of numeric type, to assign it the value of the web session variable, which will be of character type, we'll have to convert this information into numeric type. This is achieved with the toNumeric method. Next, we do the same for the attraction name from and attraction name to variables. We run the application again and test its behavior. We filter all the attractions in China between A and M. In this case, only one attraction will be displayed. We select the action to update it, and remember that at that moment, before invoking the transaction, the data of the filter variables will be saved in memory. We change the photo and confirm the action. And when returning to the web panel, as has been mentioned, the first event that will be executed will be the start event, where we program the retrieval of the information saved in the session variable, assigning those values to the filter variables. Note that now, the values entered in the filters are maintained as desired. In addition, after the start event, the refresh event will have been triggered, which in turn will have triggered the grid loading according to the filters. That's why the grid is filtered again with the modified photo. But once this has been programmed, what will happen when the user first opens this web panel in a browser? In that case, there will be nothing saved and therefore nothing to retrieve. We close any active sessions on the browser and run the application again from Genexus for the entire cycle. We open the web panel we've created. And since this session is the first time the web panel is run, the first thing that's triggered is the start event. The session variable will look through the entered keys to see if there's any information to retrieve, but there won't be any, as no value has been stored in the web session variable yet. So, at this time, the variables used for filters will remain empty. All the attractions are displayed because in the grid conditions, it has been indicated not to apply any filter if these variables are empty. For example, select a filter by the country France, and we'll see that the grid already applies the filter, showing only the attractions that have France as a country. As attraction name from filter, we enter the letter F, and at that moment, the refresh event is triggered again, followed by the load event. And finally, in the attraction name to filter, we enter the letter O. We select the update action on the Matisse Museum attraction, and at that moment, the update.click event is triggered, in which we programmed that before invoking the attraction transaction. The data of the filter variables is saved in the web session variable. To this end, the set method of the session variable is used, passing the key and the value that we want to save in a parameter. In this case, there are 3 values to keep in memory. They are the variables country ID, attraction name from, and attraction name to. At this point, the attraction object is invoked and becomes active, and the web panel object is destroyed along with its variables. We change some data of the attraction. For example, its photo, and we confirm the action. It'll then take us back to the calling object, that is, the web panel. The values saved in the session variable will be loaded in the start event. This is done using the get method, passing by parameter the key used to save each value in the event update.click using the set method. This data will be assigned to each corresponding variable, in this case, to the 3 variables used for the filters, country ID, attraction name from, and attraction name to. After this, the refresh event will be executed, and then the load event for each record to be loaded in the grid. In this case, there are 2 attractions that meet these conditions and will be loaded in the grid. For this reason, the load event will be executed twice. What we see on screen is that the values entered in the filters are kept after updating a record. In this way, we learn to use the session variables provided by Genexus, so that at any time we can save information in it and then retrieve it when necessary. As Genexus users, we often need to save the state of a grid to recover it later. For example, as we just saw, when we call another target and return to our web panel with a grid, and we want the filters we entered to remain. For this reason, a property called SaveStateProperty has been added to the grid control in the latest versions of Genexus. Basically, what this property does is to allow us to save in memory, in a web session variable, all the information about the state of the grid page we're in, the filters applied, and so on. When this page is reloaded, the last known configuration is automatically restored, which is what we did manually during this video with the session variable. But it'll be done by configuring a property in an automatic and totally transparent way, since we will not see added code in the generated objects. Let's see it at runtime. First of all, we delete what we did in the event section of the web panel, leaving it in the initial state of the video so that it's not saved anywhere. From our web panel object, we select the grid and look at this new property that we mentioned, which, by default, does not disappear when it's false. We change it to true and run it again. We enter values in the filters and select to modify the information of one of the attractions. And as we saw, this calls from one object to another, and then when we confirm the action in the called object, it returns to the calling object. We make changes and confirm. And when we return to the web panel, we see that the filters are kept, with the state it was in before calling the attraction transaction. Even if this grid had paging, we would still keep the position we were in before updating the record. We have two other ways of saving and retrieving context information, which we will not go into in more detail. One of them is by using the following methods of the grid control. Save session state, which allows saving the state of the grid, and load session state, which will allow retrieving the state of the previously saved grid. Using these methods is equivalent to using the save state property of the grid that we just saw. The other is by using the client storage external object. This object is an API, which is used to store context information in applications for mobile devices. Its use and operation is similar to that of web session variables. It allows storing information with key value pairs, locally that is, on the mobile device we're in, and it'll be possible to access it later, even without connectivity. For more details on each of these implementations, please visit our wiki.